Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the 401k Marketing Podcast. We are joined by Brandon Helms of MarshBerry. So, hi, Brandon. Welcome to the podcast.
Yay. Hey, everybody. Glad to be here.
Today, we're going to be talking about building blindfold. So 5 ways advisors can build more value in your business. So Brandon and I were talking, and he has a lot of experience, just like almost 20 years now of experience in this exact marketplace, seeing many different channels from the advisor side, from the event side, from the back office side, as well as being a wholesaler and now on the M&A side. So oodles and oodles of best practices that Brandon knows. So one of the things we talked about was how many advisors have grown their assets under management, assets under advisory to these unbelievable levels. Great job. Great job. And you've used your relationships and your charismatic personalities to build super successful practices. However, sometimes it might feel like you're building blindfold. And what that means is that there's a focus typically on growing AUM and revenue to get to this certain kind of magic number. But it may not mean that there's this clear long-term vision, strategies to maximize that enterprise value, and a plan that's going to make sure that your business is going to live on for generations to come. So Brandon today is going to talk about focusing on organic growth. And Brandon, I'm going to just kind of pass it over to you and say, what does organic growth look like? And why does it matter?
Yeah. Thanks, Rebecca. That was a great intro, although I feel old now. I mean, I just turned 40. So you're right on the 20-year dynamic. And the best part is I think we've known each other now for almost 15 of those 20 years, going all the way back to when I was on the advisor consulting side. And as Rebecca highlighted, I helped build 2 $20 billion plus DCDB consulting teams, both of which used financial wellness to bridge the gap between the institutional relationship and the individual clients. And so that's been my secret sauce and unique value, to be on the inside of these really fast growing organizations and seeing things like culture and leadership and communication, seeing things like vision, strategy, and focus. And Rebecca nailed it in terms of, many advisors are focused on that big word of growth, right? Without a true strategy around it. And now in my role at MarshBerry, the beauty is I get to be a business consultant to advisors as they grow and develop their practice into a business and then ultimately into an enterprise. And of course, many of you have seen all of the M&A activity over the last 10 years, especially in the institutional space. And now a lot of it is happening in the private wealth space. And when you think of organic growth, most of the acquirers right now, that is the number one thing that they're looking at, is what does your organic growth look like? And for many advisors that I meet with, they say, they come out and say, hey, I'm growing at 15% or 20% as an example there. And you dive into it a little bit further and you get into the nuts and bolts. And what you find is that a lot of that growth has come from market appreciation. And so as you look under the hood, you look at many of the industry studies that are out there, whether it's Fidelity or Schwab or others. And when you get net of market return growth for many firms, it ends up being in the 3 to 4% range. So not nearly as high as what many of these owners are thinking about. And then you kind of dive into it and say, well, how can we improve that? What are some of the things that we can do? And it's really interesting if you compare the smaller advisory practices to the larger firms and what the larger firms are doing differently. You think about most advisors and, roughly 70% would come out and say, growth and marketing and business development are our number one goal for the year. And then you go to, well, how do I do that? And so for many of these firms, especially as you go up market, the biggest differences between small and large comes down to creating content. And Rebecca, I know you do a lot of work in this space, collateral content, et cetera. It comes down to doing more events. So going backwards and thinking, in person and virtual, and really using a lot of that content in a way that educates your potential client base. And then the final one is doing more PR. So I'm going to pause there because Rebecca, I know that kind of leads into your sweet spot, but that has been the biggest difference that we've seen from kind of small to large, of just, really diving back into creating your own content, educating clients, doing more events, and doing more PR work.
We've always felt that education sells because the more you inform your clients, the stronger those relationships become because they trust you. The more you update your centers of influence, you stay top of mind. So then the next time they're sitting in front of a business owner, client of their own, they can say, "Oh, I know exactly who you need to talk to because you have told those COIs what's important in the 401k world." And then for prospects, you're just chipping away at doubt. They're going, is my advisor doing this? Should my advisor be doing this? Am I with the right advisor? And obviously the answer is no, they should be working with you. And that's why education is so important. And also the way that generations are changing too, as we migrate from baby boomers to the Gen X as the next in line. Gen X really enjoys education as their primary way of saying yes to taking that next step. So what when we talk about having a strategy to stand out, and that's always top of mind for every advisor is how do I differentiate? What do I do different? What's working? So in today's current environment, it seems more and more difficult for clients and advisors to differentiate. And it's really important to have a clear communication strategy on how you're standing out. And many times it's the advisor's brand, their unique value prop, expanded service offering, better alignment with unique client values. And of course, it's like I mentioned, it's very important to clearly communicate why clients typically hire you, why you're different from your peers, and then what are some of those key items that you solve for with your clients? So niche and specialties. Brandon, in your experience, what are some of the key differentiators for retirement plan advisors?
Yeah, I mean, many of you have been in the industry for a number of years. And if you rewind back all the way to my beginning 10 or 15 years ago, you could be a unique and differentiated advisor if you had an investment scorecard, if you did fee benchmarking, if you were a fiduciary
Yeah.
321 or 338. And that was a big differentiator. And then as many of you have seen the progression over the last decade or so, that kind of became the norm and therefore forced advisors from a competitive perspective to start offering new and different types of services. It led to financial wellness as
Mhm.
an example and the proliferation of, workplace education and some of those different things. And if you think about it right now, what is really difficult in the minds of plan sponsor clients or individual consumers is how are you different than any other advisor that I'm talking to? Because everybody kind of looks and feels the same. I mean, everybody's got their scorecard, everybody's got their, pitch book that looks and feels the same. And so a few ways that I've seen, especially on the retirement side, for folks to stand out. One, if you think about, the areas that you can serve an organization and their plan, you have investments, you have fiduciary governance, you have plan design and management, you have employee outcomes, and you have expenses. And the one area that I have seen very few firms do a phenomenal job is more on that administrative side. If you were a plan
Mm.
sponsor and you sat down to design your ideal retirement plan, so you're sitting with a, HR director and a CFO and a CEO and others in the organization, there'd
Yeah.
be a lot of discussion around what's our ideal plan look
Mm.
like, but ultimately we come down to, hey, I want a plan that's the best outcome for my people, that's no risk, that's no cost. And oh, by the way, how do I get all that
Mhm.
without having to do any work? And if you can get as close to that as possible is kind of the ideal plan for most people, but where a lot of consultants have kind of backed
Mhm.
off, primarily because the record keeper or third party administrator has handled a lot of those responsibilities on the administrative side. So, sure, many folks have kind of
Mhm.
stepped in as a service provider liaison, I would call it, but very few have kind of delved into making sure to keep those service providers responsible for the work they're doing, whether it's compliance testing or notices or some of those other fun things. So that's one way.
Sure.
Recently, I just talked to a firm in the Southeast that's doing a really, really good job of promoting that as their unique value. Another one would be
Hmm.
I've seen a lot of focus around ancillary service lines. So, for example,
Mhm.
E&F work, or, I did a lot of consulting around cash balance and pension plans.
Mhm.
And those are definitely areas that have stood out in the minds of the plan sponsor to therefore then ultimately work your way back towards the DC plan and winning those opportunities. So the administrative side and then, cash balance, DB,
Yeah.
E&F, some of those ancillary service lines have been great ways to get your foot in the door.
Nice. We're working on for next couple months. It's a So with all Secure Act 1 and then Secure Act 2, there's all these new opportunities for plan provisions. And so we're working on a three-panel, the provision itself, pros, why you might want to consider it, cons, why you might not want to consider it, and then considerations, and then a white space for notes afterwards. Because there's some provisions, yeah, it makes sense, do it based on your demographics of your workforce, your goals of your retirement plan. And then there's some provisions where you're like, no, it doesn't really fit our culture. But I think a lot of times plan sponsors think like, oh, we have to do them all. And so we're gonna start talking about, let's pause. When was the plan set up? Was anyone still at the, if you're a big company, is anyone still at the company that was part of the original committee? Probably not. Like there's change and turnover. It's normal business growth. So let's take a look objectively and use that magic marker, the magic eraser that we've talked about before. And then let's start talking about pros, cons, and considerations of where do we want to take this? Like what makes sense? So I'm excited that plan design and administration is coming back because it's so important. It's literally the architect of the entire plan. So let's make sure it's the right structure.
Yeah, and of course, as you know, it's where most of the challenges pop up for plan sponsors is on the administrative side, right? And very few consultants do a great job of solving for that. The only point I'll add, and then we can point I'll add, and then we'll continue on, is just around, as an advisor, think about it like this: when you run an RFP for a record keeper search, and everybody's doing it every 3 to 5 years per the DOL, et cetera, you get the proposals, you sit through the presentations, you look at the pitch books, and it's really hard for your clients to differentiate between those service provider record keepers, right? Everybody says their service is great. Everybody says their technology is great. So think about that from the standpoint of, as you sit through those meetings and try to help your clients differentiate around a record keeper decision, they've got to do the same thing in hiring an advisor and figuring out, who's kind of your ideal client profile, and how can you stand out versus everybody else that's in the marketplace.
Anything else to add on that point in terms of advisors showcasing value, standing out, what you've seen in the real world?
I think that's great. My 40-year-old brain can only handle so much. So I think that's all I've got.
I think probably contact you directly because you definitely have lots of creative ideas. So now let's transition and talk about succession planning. I read a stat the other day that said 130,000 advisors, kind of at large, are expected to leave the financial advisory marketplace in the next decade. That seems just incomprehensible because there's only 300,000 of us total. So to have almost half leave in the next decade just doesn't feel right. But that was the stat that I read. So let's talk about this next generation. It is so vital and important to America that we have financial advisors. So how can folks listening today be intentional about developing and communicating a strategy that both incentivizes the existing team, clients, as well as onboards new advisors who can keep the organization moving forward with success for years to come? So what roles are firms hiring for today as they grow and think about succession?
Yeah, I would tell you, you think about the four big challenges that most advisors are facing, whether you're a retirement oriented team or a wealth team. And it's, how do we continue to grow and grow quickly? But number two is the human capital component, is how do we find and keep the right people? And as Rebecca alluded to, I mean, it's hard to find people. It's not like there's a huge backlog of folks coming out of college that just are desiring to get into the financial services industry, and more specifically giving advice to plan sponsors, right? And so I think it's one where, you as a firm, one, need to really start to build your brand, whether it's through your networks, whether it's through the college community, whether it's other places, just around being a place for those new hires as they come out of college and graduate and get their CFP and some of those different things to be able to join. The second component is, and this is probably harder because it's one of those functions, chicken or egg, right? It's hard to develop a career path if you don't have, the revenue and growth to be able to support those roles as you develop. But really being able to help folks be able to see, hey, if you join my organization, what does the future look like for you? What does the path look like for you? And then the last component of that, and this is the piece that, quite frankly, I was missing from a couple of firms that I was at, is a lot of the focus is on growth. It's on winning new clients. It's on, developing those relationships into other opportunities. But sometimes the piece gets missed of the long term, I'm going to call it enterprise value component of,
Mhm.
for those people that you want to stick around, developing a path towards equity or phantom equity or some kind of component that really incentivizes them to be there long term. And a lot of firms, I mean, some are certainly developing that, but a lot of firms haven't thought a ton about, how do I keep these people for a very long time? And then the
Yeah.
final component I'll just throw in there is just around the cultural aspect. Again, that's a hard one to communicate without actually experiencing it. But if you can kind
Yeah.
of go out there and say, we're building a brand in our community around these tenants. Here's our culture. Here's our dynamics. Here's the path you can go
Mhm.
down. And ultimately, if you do a good job, this is what that's going to lead to in terms of sticking around for many years to come. That's an appealing path. I mean, Rebecca, I tell you, I'm technically a millennial, but I definitely align more with Gen X. So I'm always kind of skeptical coming into things, but I still
Mm.
like the pen and paper and all that fun stuff. So, being able to appeal to the younger generations, I think is super
Yeah.
important. And even I struggle with that a little bit.
That culture aspect is so important, and just I don't think there's enough credit given to the cultural side of it. Do you come to work excited and happy and motivated and having a good time? Obviously, get your work done because that's important for business and P&Ls. But you gotta have a smile on your face, and especially if you're ever going to take over the ownership side of it, that you gotta love this business more than anything else in the world. But I definitely agree. We need to, as business leaders listening today, how are you thinking about who's going to take over the next reins? Which kind of leads into our next question, which is, if we do have a ton of advisors who are excited about the next chapter of their lives, possibly retirement, um, part-time work, what does it look like in terms of the M&A side? So to remain competitive, advisors or continue to add and expand their scope of services to be valuable to their clients. And in doing this, your clients not only receive additional value, but you can help them become more attractive to outside acquirers. I mean, M&A side, looking to add complementary services with a team that already understands how to implement that across the board. So, what types of services are firms adding to their offering if they're thinking about the M&A opportunity?
Yeah. So the beauty of me now being at MarshBerry and being a business consultant to advisors is I get to see a lot of different things. And I would tell you,
Mm.
as a firm, we're excellent at investment banking. And quite frankly, that's where most of our revenue comes from. But what I loved about the opportunity to join was, we can sit down and say, where are you at as a business owner in the life cycle of your business? Where
Sure.
do you want to go? And how can we help you get there? And so, in terms of the life cycle of what most firms are thinking about, when you're smaller, the number one thing and really the only thing you care about is just growing, right? I just need to go win and find new clients and I want to grow. Then you lead into, well, now I have to hire people to help serve these clients. Then it leads into more of the infrastructure component. I've got to have the right technology in place to be able to deliver these services. And then finally, you
Mhm.
get to kind of the service expansion piece. And that's where a lot of firms are at right now. On the retirement plan side, we talked about some of them earlier. I mean, whether it's wellness, whether it's adding additional capabilities around,
Sure.
DB plans or cash balance or E&F and some of those things. On the
Mhm.
private wealth side, it's differentiating around adding cash management, philanthropic planning,
Sure.
estate
Yep.
planning, and adding in-house trust services around in-house tax planning and tax prep. So those are a lot
Mhm.
of the different things that firms are adding. But the ultimate idea is just around, we have a client, what needs do they have and how can we help fulfill those needs, whether you're doing it at house or whether you have kind of your partnership wheel of outside service providers that can help you deliver those services. And then as you
Mhm.
kind of move through that component on the life cycle, it naturally leads into, well, we've grown, we've added infrastructure, we've added people, we've expanded our services. And then now, maybe the way for us to grow is inorganically through M&A. Maybe we acquire a firm,
Sure.
or think differently about those types of components. But those are some of the services that firms are adding right now.
I've always felt that tax planning is a huge opportunity set Tell me one business owner you know who thinks that they're not paying enough in taxes. None of them. They all think they're paying too much in taxes. And there's so many Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube videos out there on how to reduce your taxes. And I think a lot of people still feel that there's more opportunity. So if you had an in-house, not CPA in the traditional sense, but a tax consultant, which is slightly different. CPAs a lot of times will do the technical work and you sign on the dotted line, but a tax consultant is the one who can give you some other ideas besides this is how much you owe every single quarter. I've always thought that was such a good opportunity to weave in, especially as retirement plan advisors. Most of the time they talk about advanced tax strategies, but to get to that next level, I just think it's such a beautiful relationship that has a lot of growth opportunities in it for COIs. All right. Well, do you want to expand a little bit on current client demographics?
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca, you hit on the generational aspect of things right now. And, what's interesting, if you think about the future of where the industry is going, one,
Yes.
the advisor community, which you mentioned, is certainly in an aging fashion. And therefore, we have all kinds of fun conversations around perpetuation planning and some of those fun things. But you
Yeah.
think about it from your client perspective as well. And very few of advisors have kind of delved into what do our clients look like. From a retirement perspective, of course, you're dealing with primarily with committee members. From a private wealth perspective, you actually have
Sure.
individual client assets. And on the individual client side, the average age of most clients of an advisory practice right now is 58. But then if you go deeper and say, okay, what is the asset weighted age of most of our clients? It's coming in
Oh,
around 61. And then if you dive
interesting.
in deeper to that, the revenue weighted age of most clients is 65. And so, a lot of folks say, well, my average client is, 58. They've still got
Yeah.
25 plus years. But you really
Huh.
start to dive into the metrics and it kind of opens up a picture and a different conversation around, all right, well, our assets and our revenue is weighted much later. And how do we kind of figure out that next generation conversation?
Oh, I love that. Okay. So 58, average age of a wealth management client. 61 is the people who have the largest pool of assets, and 65 is when they have the largest revenue back to that office. Okay.
And that's rough. And if you want to dive deeper, take a look at Fidelity's study they've done on that.
Okay. That is like that takes research to figure out, look inside your hours tracking, your assets tracking, and then understand the metrics. So going back to that profitability per client, that is great insights. Thank you, Brendan. So that actually is a perfect transition into thinking like a steward. So many advisors are amazing students of the business, and sometimes it's hard to, when we're working in our business, to pause and then work on our business, like we just talked about. So, whether you're thinking about growth, human capital, operations, financials, or legacy, every decision should be made through the lens of how is this benefiting your clients, and when this happens to you, your firm, your employees, and then ultimately how are your clients going to benefit? So, how do advisors go from working in their business to working on their business?
Yeah, and it's one, as you can imagine, I saw firsthand of some really good, successful advisor consultants that were amazing at sales and maybe needed some additional guidance around just running the business side of things. And, they picked those up over time. But I kind of got to see firsthand of just these fast growing businesses with great salespeople that needed help
Sure.
on working on the business. And as Rebecca alluded to, the terminology that I've kind of coined now is, advisors are great students of the business, but not necessarily great stewards of their business. Because a lot of times you're just thinking about growth and how do I grow and how do I
Mhm.
get bigger and how do I serve more clients and how do I increase my income and just all those components that come with it. And then usually there's some kind of catalyst that comes into play that causes that owner to think a little bit differently. Maybe it's a
Sure.
partner that wants out. Maybe it's a conversation with, it's an outside acquirer that's interested. Just something kind of comes in that says, you know what, maybe I should think differently about how I'm operating the business. And so quite frankly, that's a lot of the conversations that we have are around, hey, where are you at? Okay, I'm thinking about hiring a COO as an example. What do I need to put in consideration? Or, the two most common things that I both heard in the DCIO side and even now are, one is, okay, I'm thinking about buying another practice in my local market. What should I be
Okay.
thinking about there? Or two is, I would love to find a junior advisor with a small book that I can add to the team.
We
It's
hear
one of
that
those,
a
if I
lot.
had a dollar for every time I heard those two
Yeah.
things, I'd be a very wealthy person at this point. But a lot of those catalysts lead to these types of conversations where it's going, okay, you
Mhm.
know what? Maybe I should clean things up and hire a COO. Maybe I need a bookkeeper. Maybe I
Mm,
should think differently around process and structure and operations. Maybe my technology stack isn't exactly what it needs to be to serve clients appropriately. Maybe as I'm thinking
sure.
longer term, we have 10 or 12 revenue streams. Maybe it makes sense to get rid of one or two of them and really hone in and focus on the ones where we can be most valuable. But you just start to think about those different things. And a lot of folks ultimately get there. But sometimes it takes 20, 25, 30 years before you finally hit that point and you've grown a successful business. Maybe you've had some turnover in employees is a good example,
Sure.
because sometimes that happens with firms as you go through those growth phases. But there's usually some kind of catalyst that spawns those conversations, and then ultimately dive into each one of your business areas and focus on making it better.
Does I don't want to I feel like I'm putting you on the spot here. Have you come across any resources that are helpful in trying to evaluate the different channels? One of them that comes to my mind is Fiduciary Decisions has a time tracking, and I believe RPAG as well has a time tracking per client, where you can add in how many hours. So that gives one opportunity set to say per client it takes X hours and we're charging X dollars, and then you can start to see kind of your hourly rate. You come across anything else that you found helpful over the years?
Yeah, it's been interesting for me because one of my prior teams started using this after I made the transition out. But
Yeah.
a lot of firms now are using the EOS solution. And Rebecca, I'm sure it comes up for you very consistently, just
Yeah.
around getting organized around the vision and structure and strategy and what are our rocks and what do we need to accomplish as a team this quarter and year. And
Mhm.
it really just gets alignment from everybody on the team on the direction you're going and then what we need to do as a team and then accountability around it. So that'd be the one that, it's pretty amazing how often that solution comes up in conversations.
Love that. Love that. So we'll put some resources in the show notes too. Last question. What can advisors do to think differently about their business?
Yeah, so this is one. I mean, you think about it from a client consumer perspective, and Lisa Salvi at Schwab would be a great one for this. But they do a lot of research at Schwab just around your ideal client profile and then your employee
Hmm.
value proposition. And I think the one area there is just really honing in. And I'd even tell you this: I'm doing this for me personally now, because I came from a world where worked with a very specific type of advisor and size firm, and
Hmm.
now both in geography in terms of size and in terms of type of advisor,
Yeah.
the scope has been broadly expanded. And what I found the first couple of weeks in is, oh, well, I'm going to go to Denver, I'm going to go to Milwaukee, I'm going to go to all these places, and I'm like, what am I
Yeah.
doing? I don't really have a good strategy around it. And so it's really focused me even personally to say, okay, who is my ideal target consultant to work with, and I'll
Hmm.
kind of put out the four bullets that I came up with, which is one, they're growing, and they need help. Number two is they're
Hmm.
intentional about the business that they're building. Number three is they value objective guidance and advice. And so those are kind of the main things that I'm looking for is, I talk to these various consultants because everybody's not going to be a good fit for the services. So I'm thinking about it, even from a personal perspective as well. And then you think about it from your client standpoint, who does your ideal client profile look like? And really going deep. It's not just, hey, I serve, 3 to $20 million plans in any industry, as an example. It's really going deep to say, hey, look, we've got a unique niche in serving, as an example, faith-based organizations, schools, churches, denominations, et cetera, and
Hmm.
really understanding what that looks like so that you can align your messaging, with those different groups. And then you think about your differentiation, and this is from a really high level, right? I mean, there's kind of three ways you can typically differentiate: product leadership, mass customization, and customer intimacy. And I think one for many of you in this conversation, that customer intimacy portion of it. I mean, we're all trying to get to the customization, I would say, especially in the DC space, around how to customize for the masses. But that intimacy, I think, is really important in understanding how you can, really deepen the relationship with those clients. So I'll be quiet there, Rebecca. Hopefully that helps.
That was lovely. Thank you. All right. Well, today we talked about 5 ways advisors can build more value, focusing on organic growth, have a strategy to stand out, be intentional about your succession planning, ways to expand services to be more attractive, and then why it's important to think like a steward within your business. Brandon, if anyone wants to contact you to tap the great resources and knowledge that you have, how can they reach you?
Yeah, and I would tell you back, Rebecca, even if we don't work together commercially, I'm always happy to be a resource for folks. So I'm just putting that out there. You've got, of course, my email, brandon.helms@marshberry.com. I'm on LinkedIn. And then my mobile is area code 704-607-1041. I'm sure you'll include the info in the notes as well. But lots of fun value to add for folks, lots of fun conversations. And it's just amazing the opportunity that you have as an advisor to really help folks steward, whether it's their retirement plan, whether it's their private wealth assets. But there's so much trust that's involved when it comes to money. And everybody in this conversation, you're having a huge impact in their lives and ultimately in the industry that we all get to serve together.
Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you so much for listening to today's 401k Marketing Podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of our guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of 401k Marketing. The content has been available for informational and educational purposes only. We hope you enjoyed.